This video focuses on the power tools needed by a beginning woodworker or DIYer that you can acquire for less than $1,200. Hi, Jim Vanderschaft, Down East Wood Art. Welcome to my shop. What I want to do for this video is a series of segments on the power tools that I would recommend for the beginning woodworker. And I put together a bunch of notes for myself just so I make sure I don't miss anything. But basically, the power tools I'm going to recommend are for building what I call rectangular furniture. What do I mean by that? I mean cabinets, I mean tables, I mean footstools, I mean end tables, all sorts of things like that. Not turn furniture, not with a lathe, and not furniture that you're going to do an excessive amount of sculpting on, like a Maloof chair, that you really do more than carving. You actually sculpt the wood out. So I'll go through all the major tasks of woodworking and broken down by categories, and then talk about each of these tasks and what tools are useful for these tasks. And then when we get to the end, I'll make my recommendations on the best tools or the most appropriate tools for the beginner. So the first task is over here, measuring and marking. And these are common tools that I use all the time in my shop. Obviously a tape measure, and if you don't know about tape measures, they're both metric and English units. They have a little slide at the end that you push against to measure this way, or you hook it over the end to measure this way, and it moves back just a little bit to give you an accurate measurement. They're not the most accurate tools in your arsenal, but they certainly do give you an indication of distance. And you can lock them in place as well. They're very handy for that. When it comes to something more accurate, I use calipers, and this is digital readout. You can put it in fractions, you can put it in metric system or English, and very handy for determining various things, various measurements. Again, dividers. This is a lovely device because you can just turn it and move back and forth like that and get your measurement quite quickly. Very handy when you have multiple measurements to make. Obviously squares come in a lot of different sizes. You can have a square like this, you can have a short little square, a quick square, you can have bigger ones, etc. like this, or this very handy device for measuring and marking that I use all the time. And it has a pen that goes with it, and the pen lead fits in the crack, and you can measure in very small gradients. Just a lovely tool. I put links to all of these down below. So that's useful. Obviously for drawing circles, a compass, and a protractor for measuring angles. Very useful device for measuring angles. Marking pens, sometimes what I do is mark in red, just if I'm making videos, to make sure that I've got a good clean mark, and of course marking pencils. So that's it on measuring and marking. These are basic, not expensive tools at all, and should be in the arsenal of every serious and beginning woodworker. Next major topic is cutting. And cutting involves several tools. One of the most important, or one of the most useful in my shop, happens to be this table saw. It's a small contractor saw basis. This happens to be a DeWalt 745. I've extended the surface of the table. The thing I like about the DeWalt a lot is the fact that it has a rack and pinion fence that is really quite accurate. I built a little extender table for it because it's a small saw, and I've done dust collection for it. I've covered that in another video. I'll point that out later on. And I just use this all the time for ripping, for cross-cutting. I threw away the miter gauge that came with it simply because any miter gauge that comes with these saws is inaccurate. I bought myself a really nice one, and then I put a fence on it to assist in making sure that I remain parallel or perpendicular when I'm making cuts. I bought this saw years and years ago, and if I was to get another saw today, I would highly recommend the SawStop saw. The problem with the SawStop is price. It's if you can afford it, that's fine, but it happens to be $1,300 just for the contractor version, not the full professional version of the saw. So that's it on a table saw. The next thing that is very useful is a chop saw or a miter saw. This happens to be a sliding miter saw. I did a video of this one before. I'll give a link to it in the video, and you can follow along with that if you want to know more. A second thing, or a third thing rather, is a saber saw. And these saws are extremely useful because you can cut curves. You can't cut curves on either the table saw or the chop saw, but you can with this. And this is a fine alternative to getting a bandsaw to start off with. If you want to have tools for less than $1,000, this is certainly something you should consider. The other thing is the blades can be put in here that will cut very finely and will cut very roughly and will cut a variety of materials. So you really have a lot of flexibility. The alternative to this, which I have in my shop, which is right back over here, is a homemade bandsaw. I made this bandsaw from scratch. It's got a sizable motor. It has all the abilities that a normal bandsaw would have. I've used it to cut 8-inch logs. I've used it to make veneers. It's quite a nice device. Lastly, and one thing I want to mention about bandsaws is that when your needs for a saw increases with time and you have a need for a bandsaw rather than a jigsaw, you can look on Craigslist, you can find them used, you can find them in a lot of different situations rather than just paying new. The last saw we'll talk about that is really nice for woodworkers, and remember I'm talking about power tools, I'm not talking about hand tools. We'll cover hand tools in another section. But this is a Japanese pole saw. Very nice. There's no top-mounted device which prevents you from cutting flat. So you can cut anything just very flat like this. If I were to cut the tops off these dowels, I could do that without worry of marring this surface just by cutting them just like that. Very nice tool. So you can get into places with this saw that you just couldn't get into in other places. Very nice saw. Hi, Jim Vanderscaff, and I just wanted to finish talking about the table saw because there's some fundamental things that I didn't cover. I talked about ripping long boards, and of course the way we do that is quite simply like this. This happens to be one that's very easy for me to adjust the fence, run that board all the way through just like that. And if the board is even longer than this one, because you can see I got things over on the other end that I run into, I simply take it back out, flip it over, and run it back through again just this way. So I can handle long boards without any trouble. Now, what about cross-cutting sheet goods? Well, sheet goods like, what am I talking about? 4x8 sheets of plywood, big sheets of plywood. There are two ways that you can do this. Here's one way. Just imagine this is a long sheet of plywood, and I would have more than one of these stands. to put the plywood on. And I would simply move this around so that, and adjust it so it keeps the plywood straight. I don't cut against a fence because that's, well, I would in this case if I was just ripping some portion of the board off. But I could do that with this big flat sheet. I was thinking that I was cutting this board and I would get kickback if I did it on a short board like this. But with a big sheet of plywood, I can ease it through. I just keep it against the fence and it'll cut it just fine. Now, the other thing that I should mention is I built this little outfeed table, and I can position that wherever I want, so that if I have a longer board or a longer sheet of goods, that helps me support that. However, for big flat pieces of plywood, I find it easier to take them to my flat table over here, but I'm just going to illustrate it on this table saw, and I've got what I call a straight edge cutting jig. And what do I mean by that? Well, imagine a big sheet of plywood is underneath this, and then I'll take clamps at the end of the board and clamp them in place on both ends, and then I cut with a skill saw, just like this. And plug it in and run and set the blade so that it's just the right depth, so that it cuts that board just right. This is way too deep, but I would cut, and you can see that what I've got is this device was made exactly for this saw, so the blade cuts right along this edge. So if it's clamped in place to the board I'm cutting, all I have to do is follow that edge and I get a perfectly square cut. This is an easier process than trying to handle it on a table saw. Okay, the other thing is cutting dados. And for those of you that want to use a small table saw like this to cut dados, this has limitations because you can only put 1/4 of an inch thick dado set together on the blade because it has a very short arbor. So that's a limitation. You can't cut the big ones. But what I do is I use, again, another jig, and I do it with a router bit to make whatever cuts I need, whatever dados I need. So the last thing I want to talk about, but not the least important, is safety. Please, please do not use a table saw until you understand all the aspects of safety when using them. This is a little handmade device that I made. It's called a feather board, and it has little grooves for the miter slot. Little boards that fit in the miter slot. So you would line up a board that you want to hold in place like that, lock these down, and then you'd slide that through and make the cut. When you slide and make the cut, you don't want your hands anywhere near that blade, so you use various things called push sticks to push it through all the way, keeping your fingers away from the blade. This is one that comes with the DeWalt saw, but I've made another one like this, and that just hooks on the edge and allows you to go through. Besides the obvious thing of keeping your fingers away from this blade, the other thing you want to be very concerned about is kickback. And I'll just show you one of the ways that you can get kickback. If you are cutting a board like this, and you are going to, let's use the other end because you can see then that's flush against the fence. Let's say I just want to cut off a piece of the board, just like this. Do not, I repeat, not cut a short board against a fence like that and push this through. what will happen, even though you have a riving knife, which helps to keep that board straight, this board will tend to bite into the saw blade will tend to bite into the board and kick this thing back at you, which is one of the reasons why you stand to the left of the table saw. And the way to do this kind of a cut is, again, through a little technique that I devised some time ago with one of these rocker clamps. If you have to make that kind of a cut, this happens to be exactly 2 inches wide, okay? So I clamp it to my saw, just like this, and I move my saw. Let's say I wanted to cut that at 6 inches, I'd put it at 8, because that gives me the right distance. Then I dig out my miter saw. Again, this is on a long board. This keeps it square to the edge. And when I run it through, before it's cut off, this board has passed where the blade is. You can see it's not all the way cut through, and it's past the blade, so now it just drops off after it's cut. So that's a very important way to avoid kickback. Okay, so now we want to talk about joining. And there's 2 aspects of joining which are important. First of all, joining is just joining 2 boards together depending on the type of the strength necessary for that joint, and whether or not you choose also a joint because of the potential for wood movement. Now, I don't know if you know or not, but wood does not move in this direction with different levels of humidity in the air. It does move in this direction. It expands or contracts depending on how much moisture is in the wood. And if you think of wood as being a whole series of drinking straws glued together facing in this direction, you can see why that would be, because they just expand. So if you're going to join wood at different angles to how the wood expands and contracts, then you have to take that into account, especially for wider board situations where you have a table, for example. The other thing is glue adheres to a surface and makes a better joint if you're gluing the faces of the board or the edges of the board. If you try to glue the end of the board, the end grain of this wood does not hold well. This is called the end grain, and this is the face grain, this is the edge grain. So edge grain is very good, face grain is very good, end grain is very poor. So once you think about wood movement and the necessary strength in the joint, then you can really get a better feel for all the different kinds of joints there are. Let's just talk about some simple ones that you can see. This happens to be a box joint on a little small box. That's extremely strong joint. It's not necessary for this box. It's just a decorative joint, but it's very useful. On the inside here, this little bottom slides into a groove, a dado that's cut all the way around. It's just cut with a table saw, but that's another kind of a joint. We can make sliding joints like this. That's another part where you want it to be able to move as opposed to held in place. We make miter joints. What are miter joints? Miter joints are cut at a 45-degree angle like that. This is a little box that I put together, and then to strengthen that joint, I just made little splines in all the corners. They go through the wood in both sides, and they just make that joint stronger, because by itself, again, the miter joint is not strong because you're trying to glue the end grain of the wood. Other joints are the dovetail joint. This is an example of dovetails all the way around. You can see that. There's an example of a wooden hinge joint that sort of disappears when you close the box. So you've seen those. Another kind of joint that's very strong is a lap joint, just like this. You cut both pieces of wood so they just overlap and fit like this. What are other joints? Other joints are mortise and tenons, and this just happens to be a mortise. What I do in many cases is I cut mortise in both boards that I want to join, like this. Just imagine there's a mortise cut there, and then I use what's called a floating tenon. I just cut this off and glue it to both sides, and so it essentially is the strength of a mortise and tenon joint. Another kind of joint is a dowel, just like this, that's put into the wood, and there are a wide variety of doweling jigs that you can use to align the dowel joint, make sure that it gets cut just correctly, the right distance, so that if you join two boards together, such as if we were putting these two together like that, we'd make this face on both sides correctly, so we'd measure the exact distance that we'd want it off. This is just a simple doweling jig. There are much more complicated ones out there. Joints can be used for other purposes. On a table, I mentioned before the idea of wood movement. If you have the boards running longitudinally like this on the top of a table and you have an apron underneath, well, the apron is going at cross purposes, if you will, to moisture content. If it's like this, the board is flat on top and there are several boards across the top, this board is not going to expand in this direction, but the top boards will. So you have to allow that movement on a large table. And one of the ways that you do that is on the underside of the table, you cut a little mortise in the apron. That would be in here. And then you do that such that joint is not completely tight and allows movement back and forth like this. And then you just screw this down. It holds it tight to the tabletop and it allows wood movement. Other devices which achieve the same purpose are these little metal tabs that you put, again, on the top of the apron and on the board crossing it, just like that. They, again, allow wood movement. Joints can be simpler, and joints can be used for specific purposes. This happens to be a device for making pocket screws, pocket joinery. And what you do is, if I was to put a pocket joint into this piece of wood and I wanted to join it like this, then I would lock this in place just like this and adjust this for the thickness of the wood, then come in with a bit and a drill and drill a pocket hole, which makes a pocket in here, and then you use a screw to hold it down. Now, pocket screws have gotten a bad rap in some circles, and the reason is, I believe that people have misused them, thinking that they provide more strength than they do. First of all, they're not good in a situation where wood movement is needed, and they're not good where a lot of strength is needed, but they are good for cabinetry. If you want to join large box cabinets together, you could nail them or screw them together to supplement that joint, but they're quite adequate for that purpose because there's not a wood movement with plywood, there's no wood movement, plus the cabinet by itself does not need to be that strong. Have I talked about dovetails? Dovetails are just a beautiful thing. I cut them with a jig that I have for both the table saw or the router, and I also cut them by hand. I think everyone would appreciate having the skill to be able to cut these by hand. Joints of all kind, it just never seems to stop. This happens to be a joint created by Sam Maloof way back when for his beautiful rocker. Just think of this as the table seat and think of this as the leg. This happens to be the front leg. And you put this joint in place, and then you put a screw into it, and it is one of the strongest joints that I've ever seen. So, as you can see, there's a lot to this joint, but you make that with a router and put it together, and it's really quite something. So let's see, anything else for joinery? Yes. For example, you can spend a lot of money on a domino joiner. It's an extremely accurate device. But do you need it to start off with? Absolutely not. You want to spend $1,500 for just a joiner? I don't think you need to do that. There are other ways to do it. I can do my mortise and tenon floating joints on a router and find that quite adequate for my needs. Okay, we've talked about enjoining several useful tools. I want to tell you about a tool that I purchased some time ago that I find unnecessary, unuseful. I would never use it again, and that's called a biscuit joiner. It's a tool that allows you to cut a little, you do this on the table like that, and then you push this in, and a blade comes out there, if you can see that blade. And that rotates, and it cuts a slot in this board, and then you would do that, the same thing on this board, and then imagine these are very long boards. You put the biscuit in with glue, the biscuit expands with the glue because it's wet, and you join the two boards together. And the whole idea is that it supposedly adds strength and helps with alignment. Well, imagine you're doing a tabletop, and that's what I originally used these biscuits for. You buy them in different sizes. Imagine you're doing a tabletop that's as big as this workbench. Well, you've got a lot of boards that are 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 inches wide, and they have a long gluing surface. Well, the long gluing surface is sufficient to hold the boards together. They're never going to break right at the glue joint if you've cut the joining surfaces properly. And that's easy to prove. In terms of alignment, the most important thing that you can do is get good flat boards surfaced properly so they've got uniform thickness, are straight along the edge, and then you clamp the ends. You clamp crossways in a way that that joint comes together just perfectly. A biscuit helps with alignment a little bit, but if you are requiring a biscuit to bring boards together that are bent, you might as well forget about it. You should start off with better quality wood surfaced properly to make that happen. So a biscuit joiner, not good. I wouldn't use it. I don't need it for anything at all. Just an example of where you can spend money where you don't need to. That's it.